the future of the Secret Services.
Good evening and welcome to Back to the Future. Tonight we're talking about the future of Britain's intelligence services. I'm Liz Forgan, a journalist. With me from Moscow, Washington and London are the spies, cabinet ministers and Whitehall bosses who fought the Cold War. Between us we include some of the most brilliant liars of our time and some of the most upright seekers after truth. I hope you will feel confident about which are which. What sort of people will the spies of the future be? Who is the enemy? What are the weapons? What are the objectives? Will we still need intelligence services at all? These 7 men all have first-hand experience of the intelligence world. I say men because intelligence remains something of a boys' game despite Stella Rimington and Mata Hari. Sir Percy Craddock was chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee for 7 years, from 1985, which means he effectively ran Britain's intelligence community during the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the Gulf War. Lieutenant General Sir Derek Boorman was Chief of Defence Intelligence and also Sir Percy's deputy at the Joint Intelligence Committee. He tried to bring modern management ideas to the intelligence world and is keen on public accountability. This has made him some friends, but most of them not inside the Secret Services. Our 2 politicians, both former Secretaries of State for Defence, are Conservative MP Tom King and Labour's Dennis Healey. Sir Patrick Nairn has been a top civil servant. He was Dennis Healey's Private Secretary at Defence and was a member of the Franks Committee that investigated the origins of the Falklands War. Leonid Shebarshin spent his working life in the KGB and ended up its head of foreign intelligence. He now runs a private security consultancy in Moscow. James Woolsey was Director of Central Intelligence in the United States from 1993 until 1995. For over 40 years, from the end of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, Britain's intelligence services were focused on the Cold War and the communist threat. Our friends were the United States and NATO. Our enemies were the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We each knew a good deal about the other. Everybody's spies met everybody else's spies at embassy cocktail parties. There were rules. Then the Soviet Union collapsed and both sides found themselves in a strategic limbo, and we're still in it. Sir Patrick Nairn, it's the year 2002. The new PM has asked the Cabinet Secretary for a new brief about Britain's strategic priorities in the world. And by the way, the Cabinet Secretary wants you to do the work and make it snappy because the attention spans of the Cabinet is not very long.
I don't think the world is going to be any less dangerous than it is now. And I don't think that the British government is going to be able to take its eyes completely off any part of the world. I would advise that our intelligence tasks should concentrate first on anti-terrorism. I think it will be crucial that we manage to sustain political and military intelligence that will identify the kind of dangers that are imposed by the IRA, by Muslim militants, by other terrorist fanatical groups, that impose dangers that can threaten the lives of ordinary people in public places. This will provide us some safeguard. They are working as far as possible with allies. The second area, which is a well-known one, and we must sustain it as well, is political, military, technical, I think, and scientific intelligence to identify the defense capabilities of those countries with which our forces, again on their own or with allies, may have to be engaged. The end of the Cold War didn't bring complete peace. Iraq and Argentina demonstrated that we could be involved again in military action. And if we're to plan our own defense capabilities, we need intelligence about the defense capabilities of those who may threaten us. If I could add, Liz, one other sentence. I don't think that we shall fail to be involved again under the United Nations banner with the humanitarian, the peacekeeping role. Well, one can't, I believe, survey the whole waterfront with your intelligence organization, certainly not in one country. But I think one must retain sufficient flexibility among your intelligence resources to be able to respond to those situations with intelligence as well.
Dennis Healey, that sounds as if the world may have changed, but Britain's security requirements are going to be even more extensive and elaborate than ever. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't say more elaborate or extensive. I think the most important single area for intelligence of the old type will be to try to understand enough not about the policy of foreign governments, but about internal affairs in foreign countries, because the most likely wars in the future are going to be conflicts inside national boundaries, some of which may drag in whole countries, like, for example, the Bosnian conflict.
I think that's right, but I think you have to add one other area of major importance for intelligence work, and that is the emergence and development of maverick states, armed probably with weapons of mass destruction. I mean, the one thing we have seen happening over the last years and since the end of the Cold War has been the growing capability of states like Libya, Iraq, possibly Iran. And we're reminded every day of the difficulty of handling a tough, determined Middle East dictatorship with money and an ambition to acquire these weapons. So this is going to be a very big area of necessary information. And also we'll need just to think about the very great remaining armory of nuclear weapons in Russia and the uncertainty of possible future Russian governments. We can't entirely forget about that, though more and more we're concentrating these days on the Libyas, the Iraqs, and so on.
Leonid Shebarshin, would you think this was a wise course of action for Britain to continue to keep an eye on the former Soviet Union, but to shift the emphasis elsewhere?
Yes, if I may make some general observations. Intelligence is not a product of Cold War of confrontation. Intelligence is inherent in the human society as it exists from times immemorial, and the society is not going to change radically, in any case, in any foreseeable future. There will be rivalries, there will be conflicts, and unfortunately not a real single source of conflict has been eliminated recently.
Right, absolutely.
And to talk that with the disappearance of communism, the world came to a happy state is a great gross misconception. So we should talk, when we talk about intelligence, we should talk not about enemies, not about friends, but we should talk about targets. We should talk about potential threats. And the history never stops, fortunately or unfortunately. And there are many things which could not have been predicted, even in our lifetime, things which changed the international situation radically. For instance, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, or to go a bit deeper, the invention of nuclear weapons. Who could think about it comparatively not so long ago?
One of the most striking things, for example, we discovered after the end of the Cold War is that we grossly exaggerated the actual fighting capability of the communist forces in Eastern Europe. And we grossly exaggerated the economic capability of Eastern Germany. And as long as intelligence is collected by people who have an interest in dealing with potential enemies, they're likely to exaggerate the capability of an enemy, which they certainly did in the case of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I think the most difficult single thing, though, is intentions, because even if you get a picture of a country's capability, the important thing is to know whether the government concerned is going to use its capability against you. And here intelligence has repeatedly let us down.
But
Do you think that's a fair accusation, Sir Percy? Intelligence has repeatedly let us down in this regard?
No, I don't.
We weren't very clever at spotting
I think
what's
it's a
gonna
very
happen in the
common
Soviet Union.
misperception, if I may say that, with great respect to Dennis. The fact is that intelligence works mostly in the dark. The intelligence successes are mainly unsung. They are the terrorist attack that doesn't take place, that's aborted. It's a bit of negotiation that goes through smoothly. It's the thoughts of aggression that become second thoughts and are abandoned. Whereas, of course, the intelligence failures, and there are bound to be intelligence failures because you're tasking a man, asking him to look at the future, which is impossible. The intelligence failures are, of course, the headlines the next day.
Can we stick to the Soviet Union for a minute? Because I would like to ask Leonid Shebarshin, were you surprised by how surprised the West was at events that surrounded the end of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union?
Yes, we saw all the troublesome symptoms in the developments in the Soviet Union during the second half of the 80s. So in principle, there was no surprise as far as general trends were concerned. But in this kind of dynamic situation, it's useless to try to predict specific events and specific turns the situation may take. Some people are trying to do that, but it's mere guessing. You cannot do that in principle. But you should predict, you should foresee how things are going to develop. And in this sense, there was no surprise for us. We were trying to warn Mr. Gorbachev that things are not going too well for the country and for him.
And did he not listen to you?
No. He was carried away by the events, and he just closed his eyes and stopped his ears. He did not want to listen to unpleasant things which were trying to tell him, and he was accusing the KGB of giving him biased information, and he started to grumble openly.
James Woolsey, you, I think more recently than anyone else, had a conversation with a president and discussed an agenda for an intelligence service in the early 90s. You've heard this discussion about the state of the world 5 years hence. Do you agree with the agenda that we seem to have ended up with? It still sounds pretty complete to me. Is the United States still thinking about the entire world as it's...
Well, yes. I mean, I think, particularly as Sir Percy and Sir Patrick stated it, rogue states, terrorism, capabilities for potential adversaries, even though one can't follow everyone's intentions all of the time. I've said before that after the Cold War, it was as if we'd been struggling with this dragon for 45 years and we finally killed it, but found ourselves in a jungle full of a lot of poisonous snakes. And in many ways, the snakes are harder to keep track of than the dragon was. The snakes were quite adequately described here. One does need to do that. One way to save on resources is, I think it is no secret that Britain and the United States work very closely together in intelligence. We complement one another not only with capabilities for collecting intelligence, but the somewhat different perspectives are often of great advantage to us. And in these days and times, on some matters, we cooperate closely with the Russian intelligence services. So one way that one can keep from spending vast sums is through intelligence liaison from country to country.
The poisonous snakes of principal interest to the United States perhaps may become more different from the poisonous snakes of priority interest to the UK.
I don't think so. The question really is, can there be, not only between the United Kingdom and the USA, but can there be with other governments more widely and more effectively cooperation that could actually save resources? Well, the experts will know the answer, but just let me make one other point. I mean, clearly one can't exchange information about your sources, but can we not go further and save resources in terms of sharing the outcome of the collection agencies and in sharing the work done in analysis and assessment?
Yeah.
I think this discussion illustrates just the point that there is that central, if you like, core business of capabilities that has to be done. And that, of course, can be collaborative because often it is not of a controversial nature and it need not give access to particular UK or other national sources. But I think that's uncontroversial. What is controversial, and I take the point of Dennis Healey's criticism, is why did we get it wrong so often in the sense that we overstated the military potential of erstwhile aggressors? Now, it's easy with the wisdom of hindsight, because we were all there trying to work out these problems. But I think part of the answer is not to assess in a direct form of a threat, is to look at a country as a society in general, not only its military base, but its economy, its cultures, its universities, what its young people are thinking about. May I say, its music, its poetry, and its literature. If you can take a more embracing view of a society and not hand it over to the military, I say it against myself, that you've got to be very careful not to be, if I could say, too gung-ho about assessing a possible threat from a third country.
There is just one funny thing about this discussion. Nobody has mentioned Europe yet. Let me just ask Sir Percy Craddock, would you be comfortable about seeing Britain gradually shifting the focus of their intelligence friendship from the United States to our European allies in the European Union?
No.
As Europe moves closer together, and I think it's going to happen, it will probably be not just a financial or an economic union, it in the end will probably be a political integration. And that may well provoke efforts further down the road to have unitary intelligence services for Europe. But that, I think, is a very long way off, and I don't see at present that this is a very real question. I think that we in Britain certainly will retain our very close intelligence and defense links with the United States, and at the same time remain pretty good Europeans.
And we all spy on one another for economic intelligence, don't forget. And this is quite a problem. I mean, I noticed the Germans have expelled a French diplomat for trying to set up a little network for commercial advantage, and they've done that recently with an American too.
A couple of years ago, French expelled some American diplomats. It was in '95.
Yeah.
For exactly doing this economic,
I remember.
economic
Mr.
job.
Shebarshin, could you imagine that the European countries could collaborate together on an intelligence operation? You've seen us all spying on each other.
They are collaborating, and it is inevitable, and the targets were already identified. Terrorism, organized crime, narco-traffic, and so on. All these services, to this or that extent, are cooperating, but intelligence is a purely, nearly 100% national institution, which is a reason for its existence is protection of national interest. And tell me, name me a couple of countries, maybe the United States and Britain is the closest example, whose interests would completely coincide. Sometimes they overlap. So the areas of overlapping are the areas for cooperation. But they are never 100% identical.
Let me draw a distinction here. There's intelligence and then there's intelligence. In NATO, we share quite broadly material, and particularly during the Cold War about capabilities on the other side. And there was and is a good deal of intelligence sharing. But on extremely sensitive matters, the Germans have a phrase, unter vier Augen, under four eyes, between two people. The only real intelligence sharing on matters of great sensitivity is one intelligence service directly with another, sometimes right at the head of state level. For example, for around 10 years, a Polish colonel, Kuklinski, was a spy for the CIA and was giving us continually the Warsaw Pact's war plans. I used to keep a picture in my office of him long after he had defected to the United States, of him with General Akramayev and General Moiseyev holding a piece of paper for the two of them to sign. I rather imagine that this was long before my time at the CIA, but I rather imagine back in the 1970s, the very top of British intelligence might have had some idea that the CIA had some kind of source inside a senior level of the Warsaw Pact. What they would have more likely known is that we had the Warsaw Pact war plans, but even that would have been limited very strictly within both the U.S. government and the British government. And I doubt, although I'm not certain about this, I doubt whether that would have been shared with many other of our allies, although perhaps a few, in a very, very limited way. But there are degrees of intelligence sharing depending on the sensitivity.
Sir Patrick, the Cabinet was grateful for your initial position paper. You've heard their discussions. Would you like to minute for us the conclusions that we appear to have reached about our intelligence priorities for the year 2002?
When I worked in the Cabinet Secretariat, I always, in preparing the Prime Minister's brief, provided him with a summing up in advance of the meeting. Much more difficult to do it after the discussion has actually taken place. Well, I think we're all agreed that the world is going to present as exacting, and in some respects a more exacting, intelligence task than we had during the constraints of the Cold War. I think that our response to that has got to be, as several have emphasized, on a wide political front and not simply confined to the world of military intelligence. As Percy Craddock points out, the intelligence world don't get given much credit for their successes because we don't know what they are. When it comes to their failures, of course, and we shall have more in the future as we have in the past, in my own belief is you can always be taken by major tactical surprise by an opponent who prepares carefully. You're up against the difficulty that you've got a very critical public. How is one to respond to it? I think people have got to understand the extent to which we are trying to work together where we can work together. There seems no reason why in the field of anti-terrorism and drugs, that lower level world, they're a very dangerous and nasty one, why we can't work easily and openly with our allies in Europe and to some extent where appropriate with both the former Soviet Union and with America. In the area of defense capabilities, in the area of spies, it is a more complex matter altogether. And I think that this is a matter one's really got to consider when one is looking at what can be the organization for the future and whether changes of techniques help us.
Patrick Nairn, thank you. In part two, what sort of people and organizations will the Secret Services need to deal with this changed world? In other words, have Smiley's people had their day? In part one, we talked about the threats Britain's intelligence services will be called on to deal with in the future and how different they will be from the old days of the Cold War. So if the threats are different, what else needs to change? Different institutions, different specialist skills, and how will the Secret Services cope with pressures for greater openness and accountability, not to mention tighter budget scrutiny in the second millennium? Derek Boorman, let's look at the organisations first. You spent 3 years trying to reform the Defence Intelligence Services and got, if I may say so, cut off at the knees for your pains. What were you trying to do, and why did you have to leave undone some of the things that you wanted to do?
Well, certainly we don't need an Anderson Consulting type organisation to do it for us. I think I'd established two assumptions. No, I wouldn't. I'd established two facts. The first one, in part one, we've illustrated the complexity of the continuing threat. So whether we like it or not, it's diverse, complex, and difficult, therefore, to manage. The second fact is that there'll be a continuing squeeze on resources. And indeed, in terms of that latter consideration, I would argue that as to be wholly beneficial, because I work on the assumption that any organization, especially something traditional, institutional, or that of the establishment, needs to have checks and balances and put through the ringer. To a degree, intelligence has not been put through that ringer in the way that I certainly tried to start the process. Now, what can you do? I think you've got to grasp the chestnuts. The first chestnut is that there is a divergence of responsibility, potentially, between two secretaries of state. You have, on one side of Whitehall, with the Foreign Office and its responsibilities in terms of certain collection, and on the other side, and two distinguished members here, Secretary of State for Defence, who have their own relatively autonomous part of the intelligence budget under their control. Now, I know, in fact, we all get together and reasonable men or women can do reasonable business together. But still there is that separation. And as the resources are squeezed, I think we've got to grasp it. The second chestnut is that of collection. Is there something unique in those specialist functions which requires them to be semi-autonomous, separate from each other?
In that sense, you mean the intelligence organisations themselves?
Intelligence organisations.
Should we roll them all into one
Yes.
and stop them fighting each other?
I must say I would fight shy of being too radical in imposing upon them a radical reorganisation, because I think, and having been a soldier, I've gone through the processes as a result of different Secretaries of States for Defence, amalgamations and disbandments of regiments. And it's not emotional. You are handling living organizations of very high caliber people. And so therefore, in that respect, I would be evolutionary for that chestnut.
But it's no good saying you wouldn't impose them. If you think they ought to happen, they never would happen of their own accord. No institution ever amalgamates itself with any other institution unless somebody makes it.
No, but it's the whole business of stick and carrot, how you go about it. I'm merely saying this is a chestnut that has to be handled. That's all. I'm not saying how you go
in
about
your
it.
day,
The point
did you...
isn't going to be any carrot, because the Treasury won't give you any.
No carrots, only sticks.
Yes.
Was that what you tried to do? Administer sticks?
Well, I don't want to claim too much fame for it. I just started what I thought in a very gentle way to get these questions onto the agenda. And the old lags, as I described them, and there are not many left. I mean, they're all outside the service. They'll be watching this program this evening thinking it's almost high treason, some of us being here in their voodoo follow.
Yes.
They were not receptive to change because of the very nature of intelligence, whereby it was enabled itself to be secretive, inward-looking, if I may say a little incestuous as an organization. Good reasons for it, but it produced a complacency, a lack of radically inspired thought from within.
So, Percy, you either have to agree with that or be classed as an old lag, it seems to be. Would you like to choose between those?
I think an accredited, signed-on, fully paid-up old lag in this matter. I think, this is extremely attractive, but I wonder what real economies will materialize from this process. It seems to me that you're going to have a conflict between, say, the money allotted to GCHQ, the code-breaking organization, and the money going to the security service dealing with internal matters. You are going to have that conflict, that struggle, whether you have them under the roof of one supposed unitary organization or whether you have them as at present dispersed in Cheltenham and in Whitehall. These are totally different functions. It so happens that the greater part of the money is spent on GCHQ, as in any similar organization anywhere else, but that is an extremely demanding and professional and intensively trained organization, and you're not going to change that, you know, by simply bringing them all together and saying we live under one roof.
Dennis Healey, do you accept that?
I don't really agree with Percy on the principle. I agree with his illustration. There's no question that the collection of signals intelligence, electronic intelligence, which is GCHQ's job and is done brilliantly in the United States by satellites as well, that is a thing which doesn't mix naturally with human intelligence sending spies there and there. But we're not talking about that. The real problem is the duplication, for example, among the three services on service intelligence, each having its own setup and then somebody in the middle. And they're basically so close together, and they're all protecting the interests of their service. And this is a mistake, and I think there's a very strong case for putting them together. I think there's also a very strong case, as in the United States, for trying to separate intelligence from departments which have an interest in the outcome. One reason why the CIA was the only American agency which rightly advised against entering into the Vietnam War is that it had no State Department or defense interest to protect. And I think there's a very strong case for separating human intelligence from every department which has an interest to protect.
First of all, we have the intelligence agencies fighting like ferrets in a bag between them, their institutional...
No,
That's
an overstatement.
Really? They're too nice to each other. Let's get back.
Pursuing energetic institutional
like
interests.
rabbits in a hole, which is rather a different thing.
Thank you, Dennis. On the other hand, we have the
Mumble
politicians
rather than bite.
expressing unease about the civil servants
Yeah.
ganging up and not telling what's going on. What I want to ask you now is, where is the public and their understanding of what's going on in all this? Where is accountability? Tom King, will you start us off on this? This is one of the subjects that your watchdog committee thinks about. How realistic is it to have measures of openness at the same time as a secret intelligence service? And what can we do to improve the state of things in Britain in this regard?
I hope we're proving that you can do it, and I think the United States has shown. Jim can talk about. I mean, the United States is most far forward.
I want to
Yes.
ask him to comment on our best efforts in a minute.
And they've managed so far, I think, to do quite well. We're on the learning curve. But I think that we have established, to the surprise of some, that you can take a bunch of politicians with no experience of intelligence at all, unvetted, but known to their colleagues before they're put on a committee, and put them in a committee, put them within the ring of secrecy, and trust them with secrets. And that has been my experience, that increasingly, and then if it's a two-way process, if then the agencies believe that they can trust them, what we're finding then is the agencies see our committee as a useful creature. Because then when the totally outrageous and the sort of scare story is blown in the tabloids about some disgraceful thing that has happened, previously there was absolutely no mechanism for anybody denying it. Of course the minister would deny it, but said, well, he will, won't he? And the agencies won't talk. Now you have an outside body which can build up some public confidence that they've actually taken evidence on this, they've examined this, and people can then, the agencies are beginning to see that if they trust us, we can be valuable, and we can do, and they understand also the role that we have to do, which is to make sure their agencies are working in the proper way under the acts under which they're now set up, in conformance with that legislation.
Yes, let's look at the basic structures of accountability. Would you get away in the United States with the sort of arrangements that we have in Britain, even now, as Tom says, a bit up the learning curve?
Well, I had 4 congressional committees that oversaw me, 2 appropriations committees, 1 in the House and Senate each, and 2 intelligence committees, and that's probably a total of maybe 75, 80, 85 members of Congress, plus a fairly substantial staff on each one.
Public hearings?
Public hearings on substance a few times a year on my view and the intelligence community's view of threats around the world, proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, matters of that kind, but certainly everything about budget or operations in private. When I tell friends of mine in other intelligence services, both now that I'm practicing law and before when I was in the job of the DCI, that I was up on Capitol Hill more than once a day when Congress was in session, talking to members of Congress, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in hearings. They really are appalled at the amount of time that an American director of Central Intelligence
Percy
spends.
Craddock's face was a study as you were talking.
But I must say that, and also on top of this, of course, because of the First Amendment, we can't and wouldn't have an Official Secrets Act. So there is no prior restraint on any publication in the United States on a matter of this kind.
The difference is the point that you have appropriations committees on the Hill.
Yes.
They fix your budgets. That's not, of course, our role, and that's
Right.
an absolutely key difference.
It is.
Percy Craddock, could you live with a system like this, do you think?
I think we could live with it and with a variety of systems, but the question is whether it is the best one. Let me say this about the greater openness in Britain over the last few years. I think it has helped a great deal. I think it has helped morale in the services. I think it has helped in presentation of intelligence in that it has educated and to some degree disarmed the critics. But when you come down to it, there is a contradiction in terms between open accountability for intelligence and the running of an intelligence service. It has to be a secret matter. It has to be protected by laws and by certain sanctions. And what you can do is you can introduce a small body of distinguished outsiders behind the curtain, let them see what's going on, and the public will be reassured by the fact that you have this body behind the curtain and they're not outraged by what they see. But in the end, if I could just finish, in the end there has to be a great deal of trust. I mean, Tom King's committee cannot come out from behind the arras, behind the curtain, and divulge the things that they have learnt. In the end, it has to be trust. And I think, just turning to one of the points that Jim made about his own experience, I think we have to be careful that you don't have an overactive body of inquiry who are constantly tugging at the sleeve of the collectors and the assessors, so that they spend their time looking over their shoulder and defending themselves, whereas they should be out in the field collecting the intelligence the country needs.
I had 3 very fine chairmen and 1 quite poor one, and when you have a poor one, let me tell you, it's not a pleasant experience.
Derek Boorman, is there not a more radical voice still to be heard on this?
I listened very carefully to Tom Kinn's explanation, first-hand, of the committee. I'm immensely encouraged by that. It's all happened since my time in Whitehall, and I think it's great stuff. I give it a firm tick. Percy, as you'd expect, produces an admirable, if I may say, objective statement of why there are problems about opening up. And I go along with that. But he comes to the word trust. That is my starting point. Because if you go to my children and their generation, what is required is for them to accept the integrity and independence, and your point about national security, responsibility of the intelligence organisations, £1 billion a year, 5% of defence budget, that it is being properly spent in the best interests of the nation. Now, we've all been brought up to take that. It's rather like sort of, in a way, sort of being a Christian. You've got to get to the end of the diving board and jump out. People have had to jump out into the outside, saying, these people are running it well. The modern generation will not accept that. And I find especially, where I see a little of the university that I'm involved in, and talking to undergraduates, they are deeply, for some good reasons and some false reasons, suspicious and questioning, and do not have the trust. We are facing a Freedom of Information Act, which on the whole is a good development, but it must be freedom of information, bracket, minus, close brackets. If the intelligence organizations don't live with the time and this culture, which I've rather imperfectly tried to explain, if they don't live with that change, we will have an all-embracing comprehensive freedom of information. And we will have all the problems which the United States have learnt over the years, and I think we can preempt it.
Leonid Shebarshin, you listen to us talking here about accountability and openness and all this. Do you think we're mad?
Definitely not.
Do you have the same arguments in Russia?
No, you have your own traditions, you have your own systems, which have been evolving for a very long time, and it would be quite impracticable to try to compare our experiences and our system, past and present, with your system. So I cannot say whether you are right or wrong. I cannot pass a judgment on your arguments. As far as our experience is concerned, we tried to, there was an attempt to introduce some kind of parliamentary control over the secret services. So the first effects of that control were that deputies, MPs who were admitted into the KGB, it was at the end of 91, stole some archives and published the names of our agents. After that, I'm afraid the experiment started to sour up. And so, as far as I understand now, these services are directly under the President and the presidential administration. There are committees in both the chambers of Parliament, committees on defense and state security, but I do not think that they have any real authority to oversee the working of intelligence services or counterintelligence.
Welcome back. With me are 6 men who have played leading parts in the intelligence world as spies, politicians or civil servants since the end of the Second World War. The 7th man, Tom King, has disappeared to do his accountable duty and vote in the House of Commons. We're talking about the intelligence world of the future, the world of their successors. Gentlemen, we on the outside sometimes tend to giggle a little at the failures or the excesses of spies. And maybe, I think, you encourage us to do that sometimes. But in fact, as we know, it's a deadly game. Good men and women die. Lives are changed and ruined. It costs billions of pounds, and it poses real threats sometimes in a democracy. For all the good it does, is it worth going on like this?
Yes, there are some unpleasant moments in the intelligence work. You rightly said that it's a kind of, it's not a deadly, I do not like the word deadly, but it's a very intense, very expensive activity, very intensive, very dangerous game in many cases. Its intensity changes with the tenor of the times, with the atmosphere of the times, but in essence, definitely, that's a very dangerous and risky game. Looking back, even irrespective of the result of the developments of the latest years, I believe that it was worthwhile. And I'm quite sure that in the future, those who do not want to be handicapped in this hard international life of ours, those who do not want to lose their sense of sight and hearing, they'll have to invest into intelligence. And it's going to continue as long as the humanity is divided into states, into social groups.
James Woolsey, do you think we will all want, as democratic societies, to continue to pay the prices that are paid for?
Well, around 3.5 millennia ago, when Joshua sent two case officers into Jericho, and they used a prostitute's home as a safe house, and then she arranged their egress, and as she was lowering them in the basket outside the wall of Jericho to get away, probably one turned to the other and said, "Do we have to always do this?" I imagine the answer was yes then. It was yes then, and I think it's yes now. If you believe that inventions tend to spread around the world, and I think they do, then you have to believe that anthrax, chemical weapons, biological weapons of all sorts, nuclear weapons are going to be known to more and more people. And if you believe that out of the 200 or so states in the world, at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 at any time in the future are probably going to be ruled by a Kim Jong-il or a Saddam Hussein or a Muammar Gaddafi, then you have to believe that the chance that someone somewhere over the long term is going to be planning on doing something that can badly damage the rest of us. And they will try to keep that and their preparations and their capabilities for doing that as secret as possible. And that in turn means there are going to be, I think always, needs for democracies to protect themselves by stealing the secrets of people like that, and that's ultimately what intelligence is for.
Because it becomes a bit of a dialogue. Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
My colleague is somewhat localizing the issue, but there are, in my opinion,
This is an unusual accusation to make of a citizen
no,
of
it's
the
not a
United
matter
States
of this or that country which may turn dangerous. In the beginning of this century, there was hardly a single thinking person who could imagine that there would be 2 devastating wars. Why are we so complacent now? Why do we think that threat would come only from some specific source, from some maverick country?
Well,
it is not so.
But
I think that it is an ongoing need, Liz. It's not going to change. The lion is not going to lie down with the lamb simply because the Cold War came to an end. It remains a very dangerous and a very chancy world, as my 2 friends have described it. And we don't need really to go back to Joshua. We can simply think of what intelligence did for us in the Second World War. Would we have done without Enigma, and where would we have been unless we had been able to read constantly the German messages? So I'm afraid the world isn't going to change, and the game, as you call it, is well worth the candle.
From time to time, things escape from the secret world which are manifestly ludicrous, villainous, or just wrong.
if I may say so, you talked about it being a very deadly game. The fact is, intelligence saves lives. I mean, the main purpose of intelligence through history has been to try to avoid a war by knowing enough about an enemy's capacity and will to be able to influence his policy, and that is still the case. Now we have international crime. The mafia is organized internationally. The Sicilian mafia forges dollars for the Russian mafia, with which they buy property in London. And I think the need now to know what is going on is greater than ever, and a great deal of what you need to know, the people concerned try to keep secret. And that's why you have to have intelligence services to discover these secrets. They save lives.
Patrick, I seem to have united everybody in a resounding defence of the permanent value of this intelligence world. Bring your excellent critical and analytical mind to bear on this problem. Should we be so complacent as we think?
I don't think we should be complacent, because I think we should take intelligence so extremely seriously. I mean, in the sense, I'm echoing Dennis Healey's words. I think fear, terror, death are what in people's minds. There are those who say to me, because I was on the Franks Committee, you realize that that war needn't have ever happened. It was simply a failure on the part of political judgments and on the part of intelligence. They're wrong. There's a reply to that I think can be given. But that's what they feel. When there's a terrorist attack by the IRA in London, although immensely good work has actually been done to warn us about what the IRA are up to, the public at large feel that this is yet another failure. We take it extremely seriously, and so we should.
In that case, finally and at last, gentlemen, can I ask you each to leave a small legacy to your successors but one, 5 years hence, not to be read until the year 2002, except of course by the privileged audience for this discussion tonight. Sir Percy, perhaps I wonder, did you find such a message waiting for you when you inherited your desk?
Alas, no. I would have benefited from it immensely. But I will try and rectify that by leaving a message for my successor. It's quite short. It's a quotation from a gentleman who wrote the classic, still a classic, on intelligence, a Chinese military philosopher of the 4th century BC, a man called Sun Tzu. And he said, among many other wise things, the following: know yourself, know your enemy, and you can fight 100 battles and be victorious in all. I think that would do.
Dennis?
Well, I can't beat your Chinese friend, but I think the central point I'd like to leave, whether I can encapsulate it in a sentence I'm not sure, is that knowledge is power, and a lot of knowledge you can only obtain by secret methods, because the people who threaten your life and maybe the life of humanity are trying to keep it secret.
James Woolsey?
I think I would say to a successor that there are a number of things you need to do well. You need to be clever, you need to be smart, you need to be principled. But the one thing I suppose I would emphasize is that you are the only one in the United States government who should have no policy axe to grind in calling the world as you see it and telling the president and his immediate advisors what you believe the reality is and is likely to be. You may make mistakes, you may be right, you may be wrong, but you should have no further ambitions in government if you hold this job. You should listen to your professionals and make your own judgments. Call it straight. Ignore presidential winces or national security advisors' frowns. Ignore suggestions that it would be a good idea to get on the team. Call it the way you see it and be willing to be the skunk at the garden party.
Even if your successor's career may not last very long.
He should be willing at any time to return to the practice of law or some other profession.
Patrick Nairn.
You're reassured too often in life that it may never happen. It may happen. Make sure that you keep your intelligence services up to the mark.
Derek Boorman.
Don't become too preoccupied with organizations and resource management and techniques and procedures. But remember that you are in charge of a very human organization. A very few people of very high talent. Nurture them, educate them, look after them, and make sure that their considerations prevail above anything else on your desk.
Leonid Shebarshin,
You
finally.
stole my idea. I would tell my successor, remember that the performance of intelligence depends on the quality of the young men in the field. Take care of them and imbue them with the spirit of patriotism. Every one of them should clearly realize that his country needs him. Exactly.
And there we must end this glimpse into the secret world of the next millennium. Will our collective humint turn out to be brilliantly accurate, or have we got it all wrong? Come back in 5 years and we'll see. For the moment, let me thank James Woolsey, Leonid Shebarshin, Derek Boorman, Patrick Nairn, Percy Craddock, the absent Tom King and Dennis Healey, and say good night. Good night.